The battlefield was all he had ever known. For years, Dane Voss had sold his services to the highest bidder, a nameless mercenary drifting through war-torn worlds, leaving only ashes in his wake. Empires rose and fell, and he had fought for both sides, his loyalty measured in credits and survival. He never cared who won, until the day he met Celine Varos. It should have been a routine job. A small rebel cell on Vestria Prime had been causing problems for the Orion Dominion, and the Dominion wanted them erased. Dane didn't ask questions. He never did. His squad moved in, silent and lethal, cutting through the rebel defenses like a blade through silk. Then he found her. Celine wasn't just another rebel. She stood in the center of the command bunker, her armor scorched, a plasma pistol clutched in her trembling hands. Her people were either dead or captured, yet she stared him down as if she still had a chance. There was something in her eyes, fire, defiance, something he had not seen in a long time. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You think you're just a weapon, but you're not. One day, you'll have to choose who you really are." Dane almost pulled the trigger. Almost. Instead, for the first time in his life, he hesitated. His squad moved in, blasters raised. Orders came through his earpiece. Eliminate all targets. No prisoners. And Dane made a choice. With a speed honed by years of battle, he turned, firing before his squad even realized what had happened. The Dominion troops fell one by one, caught off guard by their own man. By the time the alarms blared across the base, he had already grabbed Celine and pulled her into the shadows. They ran. Through tunnels, past smoking ruins, dodging Dominion patrols that once called him an ally. Dane didn't know why he was doing this. Maybe it was because he was tired of being nothing more than a hired killer. Maybe it was because he saw something in Celine, something worth fighting for. By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, she turned to him, breathing hard. "Why?" she asked. "Why save me?" Dane didn't have an answer. He just knew that for the first time, he wasn't running away from something. He was running towards something. The Dominion branded him a traitor. His name was burned from their records, and a bounty larger than he had ever seen was placed on his head. Mercenaries, his former kind, came for him, one after another, and he sent them all back in pieces. Celine led a rebellion, not just against the Dominion, but against the idea that power belonged only to the strongest. She had a vision of something greater, something that wasn't built on fear and war. And though Dane had never cared for causes, he found himself standing beside her, not as a mercenary, but as a guardian. He trained her people. He fought her battles. He became the shield between her and the countless enemies that sought to end her dream before it could begin. He never expected to follow her banner. But he did. And the war was only beginning. The night was cold on Vestria Prime, the kind of cold that crept into your bones, that made even the strongest soldier doubt. Dane Voss stood at the edge of the rebel encampment, watching as Celine spoke to her people. They were a ragtag force. Former soldiers, escaped prisoners, civilians who had lost everything. Against the Dominion, they were nothing more than an annoyance. Yet they looked at her as if she were a force of nature, as if she could bring the Dominion to its knees with nothing but words and fire. And maybe, just maybe, she could. Dane didn't belong here. He had spent years cutting down people like them. The only reason he was still alive was because Celine had decided he was worth keeping around. He didn't know if she was right. "You're brooding again," Celine said, stepping up beside him. "I don't brood," Dane muttered. Celine smirked. "No, of course not. The great Dane Voss, the ghost of Carthos, the butcher of avarice, he doesn't brood. He just stares dramatically into the distance and looks terrifying." Dane exhaled through his nose. "You need better people," he said. "These aren't soldiers. They're going to die." Celine's smile faded, but she didn't look away. "Then help me make them into soldiers." Dane turned to her, really looking at her. In another life, he would have laughed at the idea. But that life was gone. The Dominion had made sure of that. The bounty hunters had made sure of that. He had nothing left but the war that was coming. "Fine," he said. "But don't expect me to give speeches." She grinned. "Wouldn't dream of it." The training was brutal. Dane drilled them harder than any Dominion officer would have. He tore them down, stripped away their weaknesses, their fear, their hesitation. He turned farmers into sharpshooters, thieves into saboteurs, prisoners into warriors. He was relentless, merciless, and for the first time in his life, His skill wasn't being used to destroy, it was being used to build. But war didn't wait. The Dominion found them faster than expected. The first attack came at dawn, gunships screaming through the sky, soldiers in black armor pouring onto the battlefield. The rebels weren't ready. Dane had drilled them, but they were still green. They hesitated. They flinched. They died. Dane fought like a man possessed. He moved through the battlefield like a shadow, his twin pistols cutting through enemy lines with ruthless efficiency. He took down commanders, sabotaged dropships, turned the tide of battle with nothing but experience and brutality. But it wasn't enough. The Dominion didn't send a simple strike team. They sent him. Commander Ryden Krell, Dane's former commander, his mentor, the man who had once taught him everything he knew about war. And he had come to end him. The battlefield grew quiet as Krell stepped forward, his crimson cloak billowing in the wind. His voice carried across the wreckage. Dane Voss, after all these years, I finally find you playing hero. How disappointing. Dane clenched his jaw, stepping forward. Didn't think you cared. Krell smirked. I don't. But I do care about the price on your head. Celine tensed beside him. You know this guy? He trained me, Dane muttered. And now he's here to kill me. Krell drew his blade, a curved vibrasword humming with energy. The Dominion gave you everything, Voss. I made you. And now I'll unmake you. Dane exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He had spent years running from his past. Now he would face it. And he wouldn't run again. The battlefield seemed to shrink around them, the distant sounds of gunfire fading into the background. All that remained was Dane Voss and Commander Ryden Krell, two warriors forged in war, now standing on opposite sides of a conflict neither could have foreseen. The Dominion soldiers held back, forming a loose circle, waiting to watch their commander finish what they believed was inevitable. The rebels, battered and bloody, stood behind Celine, barely daring to breathe. Krell smirked, twirling his vibrasword, the energy blade humming like a viper ready to strike. You always had potential, Dane, he said, his tone almost conversational. You could have led armies, commanded fleets. But instead, you throw your lot in with these insects. His eyes flicked toward Celine. Is this rebellion really worth dying for? Dane didn't answer. Words wouldn't matter here. Only action. Krell moved first. A blur of speed and precision, his blade slicing through the air with the precision of a master. Dane dodged by instinct, stepping aside at the last second, his twin blasters snapping up. He fired twice. Krell deflected both shots with impossible speed, the energy bolts bouncing harmlessly into the dirt. Then Krell was on him. Dane barely had time to roll as the sword slashed down where his head had been a second ago. He landed, kicked up, and fired again, this time aiming for Krell's legs, forcing him to leap back. You're slower than I remember, Krell taunted. Maybe running with rebels has made you soft. Dane holstered one of his blasters and pulled his combat knife free. Or maybe I'm just getting started. Krell lunged, and the world became nothing but steel, fire, and instinct. Every move was a memory. Dane had trained under this man, had sparred against him, had studied the way he fought. Krell was calculated. Every strike meant to end the fight in seconds. Dane was unpredictable, moving like a man who had no rules, no honor, only survival. Krell's blade skimmed Dane's shoulder, burning a deep gash into his armor. Dane twisted, using the pain, driving his knife upward. Krell barely dodged, the blade slicing across his cheek, drawing blood. For the first time, Krell's smirk faltered. You've learned a few new tricks, he admitted. Dane spit blood onto the dirt. And you've gotten old. Then he kicked Krell in the chest, sending the commander skidding back. The Dominion soldiers raised their weapons, but Krell held up a hand. No, he growled. He's mine. Celine was watching from the sidelines, her fingers twitching toward her own weapon. But she knew. This was Dane's fight. Krell exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Fine, he muttered. I was going to give you a quick death, but you just had to make this personal. Then he activated the second phase of his blade. A second crackling energy edge extended from the hilt, turning his weapon into a dual-bladed vibrasword. Dane barely had time to react before Krell was on him again. Faster, stronger, relentless. The battlefield blurred. Sparks flew as their blades clashed, as blaster fire from distant skirmishes lit up the sky. Dane was fast, but Krell was a monster. Every block rattled his bones. Every dodge came a fraction of a second too late. Krell was winning. A final strike sent Dane crashing to the ground, his knife skidding across the dirt. He tried to roll away, but Krell's boot slammed down on his chest, pinning him. The rebels shouted. Selene took a step forward, but the Dominion soldiers leveled their rifles, daring anyone to interfere. Krell pressed the tip of his blade against Dane's throat. "This is what happens to traitors," he said. "Any last words?" Dane gritted his teeth. His hand curled around something in the dirt. "Yeah," he growled. "You talk too much." And with a sudden twist of his body, he jammed a plasma grenade against Krell's armor. The commander's eyes went wide. Boom. The explosion ripped through them both, sending Krell flying, his armor cracking, his sword clattering away. Dane hit the ground hard, coughing, blood trickling down his forehead. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the rebels charged. Selene's forces, seeing their chance, screamed into battle. Dominion soldiers hesitated. Without Krell standing, their confidence wavered. Dane pushed himself up just in time to see Selene cut through a Dominion officer, her movements swift, deadly. She reached his side, grabbed his arm, hauled him up. "You alive?" she asked, breathless. Dane wiped blood from his mouth. Mostly. The Dominion forces began to retreat. Without their commander, they had no choice. But Krell wasn't dead. He pushed himself up from the rubble, his armor cracked, his face burned, but still alive. His eyes locked onto Dane and Selene. "This isn't over," he snarled. Dane smirked, still catching his breath. "Good. I was just getting warmed up." Krell growled in frustration as his remaining troops dragged him onto a transport, the Dominion forces retreating into the sky. The battle was won. But the war had just begun. Selene turned to Dane. "That was reckless," she said. He grinned, wiping soot from his face. "Yeah," he said. "But you're still alive, aren't you?" She stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "Come on. We need to regroup. Krell will be back, and next time, he won't be alone." Dane exhaled, looking at the battlefield one last time before following her. He had once fought for nothing. Now he had a cause, and he was never looking back. As the dust settled over the battlefield, Dane followed Selene through the ruined outpost, his muscles aching, his mind still racing from the fight. The rebels were tending to their wounded, scavenging what supplies they could before the Dominion forces returned. Victory felt thin, fragile. Krell had retreated, but he wasn't gone. He'd come back, and next time, he'd bring an army. Selene walked ahead of him, barking orders to her people, her presence commanding despite the grime and blood smeared across her face. She wasn't just a leader. She was the reason these people still had hope. And now, for better or worse, Dane was part of that. He wasn't sure how it had happened. One job had turned into something else entirely. He'd saved her because he couldn't watch another innocent person die under Dominion rule, but he hadn't expected what followed. He hadn't expected to follow her banner. And yet, here he was. "You planning to keep staring at me? Or are you going to help carry supplies?" Selene's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. She stood in front of him, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised. Dane smirked. "Figured I'd let the commander do the heavy lifting." She rolled her eyes. "You're a real pain, Voss." "Yeah, I get that a lot." Despite herself, she smiled. But before anything else could be said, a blaring alarm erupted through the camp. The rebels snapped to attention, weapons drawn. Dane's instincts kicked in. He reached for his blasters, eyes scanning the horizon. What now? A scout ran up, out of breath. Sensors picked up incoming ships. Multiple signatures, Dominion. Selene cursed under her breath. "They're back already?" Dane clenched his jaw. This wasn't Krell licking his wounds. This was an execution order. "How many?" Selene demanded. The scout hesitated. "At least 5 dropships. Could be a full garrison." Murmurs spread through the rebel ranks. They'd barely survived the last fight. This one could wipe them out completely. Selene's mind was already working through the possibilities, her fingers twitching over the worn handle of her pistol. She looked at Dane. "We can't fight them head-on," she admitted. "Not like this." Dane exhaled, scanning the terrain. "Then we don't. We make them fight our way." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you thinking?" He grinned. "You trust me?" She hesitated. Then, with a sigh, "I hate that I do." "Good. Then listen up." He grabbed a data pad and pulled up the layout of the ruins. Tight corridors, collapsed buildings, narrow pathways. The Dominion expected them to run. That was the smart move. But Dane never played smart. He played dirty. "We turn this place into a kill box," he said. "Funneled choke points, hidden explosives, sniper nests. We make them bleed for every damn step they take." Celine studied the plan, then nodded. "It's risky." He smirked. "Risky's what I do best." She shook her head, but didn't argue. "All right, let's make them regret coming here." The rebels moved quickly, setting traps, reinforcing key positions, preparing for hell itself. Then, the sky darkened. The dropships descended, their engines roaring as they came down like steel gods from above. Dane checked his blasters one last time, then looked at Celine. "Ready?" he asked. She smirked. "Let's give them hell." And then, the battle began. The air was thick with smoke, fire reflecting in the shattered visors of fallen Dominion soldiers. Explosions still echoed in the ruins, but the battle was reaching its end. Dane crouched behind a broken column, reloading his blaster with practiced efficiency. His body ached, his breath ragged, but he pushed forward. Celine was ahead, leading the last charge. The Dominion forces had underestimated them. Dane's plan had worked. Tight corridors had turned into death traps. Hidden explosives had cut down entire squads, and well-placed snipers had shattered enemy ranks before they could regroup. But still, Krell remained. Through the smoke, the Dominion commander stood tall, clad in his gleaming combat armor, flanked by his last elite guards. His helmet was cracked, his rage palpable. "You're cornered, rebels," he roared. "Surrender now, and I might let you live." Celine wiped blood from her forehead, gripping her pistol tighter. "You first," she spat. Krell sneered. "You're nothing without your tricks, girl. No more traps. No more shadows. Face me like a warrior, if you dare." Dane stepped forward before Celine could respond. "She doesn't have to," he said. "Because I do." Krell's eyes narrowed. "Voss." Dane smirked. "Miss me?" Krell scoffed. "You were the best mercenary I ever hired, Voss. A shame you chose the losing side." "Funny," Dane said, twirling his blasters. "I was just thinking the same about you." And then he moved. Blaster fire erupted. The battle condensed into one final, desperate exchange. Dane weaved through gunfire, his shots precise. Krell's guards fell one by one, but the commander kept coming, his armor deflecting most of the hits. Then, in a single, fluid motion, Krell drew his vibroblade and lunged. Dane barely dodged, the blade slicing his shoulder. Pain flared, but he gritted his teeth, sidestepping, countering, striking, but Krell was fast, relentless. The Dominion commander grabbed him by the throat, slamming him against the rubble. "You could have been so much more," Krell growled. Dane gasped for air, reaching for his last hidden blade. "Yeah," he choked out, driving the dagger straight into Krell's neck. The Dominion commander froze, eyes wide. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, he collapsed. Silence followed. The remaining Dominion troops, seeing their leader fall, scattered. Celine rushed to Dane, breathless. "Are you?" "I'm fine," he coughed. "But you still owe me a drink." She let out a breathless laugh. "If we survive this, you can have the whole damn bottle." The battle was over. The Dominion had been driven back. The rebels had won. As the fires smoldered and the stars shimmered above, Dane looked around at the people who had once been nothing more than a paycheck to him. Now, they were his people. He had come here a mercenary. Now, he was their guardian. And for the first time in a long, long time, he finally knew where he belonged.